What's on your mind today? You driving through city lights winding down after a long day, or maybe cozying up before bed? When do you feel that pull for a good story? One that grabs your heart and won't let go. Let's dive into something unforgettable together. The rain in Baltimore doesn't just fall, it attacks. It comes down in thick gray sheets, turning asphalt into a black mirror of the angry sky above. On nights like this, the city holds its breath, and the forgotten people look for forgotten places to hide. Tonight, one of those people was a man named Elias Vance. He moved through the downpour not like a man who was lost, but like a shadow searching for its rightful place to rest. He was 68 years old, but the storm had carved another 20 years onto his face. His jacket, a worn-out Marine Corps field coat from a lifetime ago, was more memory than fabric, clinging to his thin frame like a second skin. It didn't keep out the rain, but it held the ghosts of old battles, and tonight that felt like company. He found his sanctuary in the narrow alley behind the Blue Sparrow Diner. It was a cathedral of the discarded, overflowing dumpsters, stacks of slick, wet pallets, and the sour smell of yesterday's dreams mixed with stale grease. Elias leaned his back against the cold brick, pulling his knees to his chest, a disciplined fold that his body remembered even if his mind tried to forget. His boots, the left one held together by a fragile prayer, and two black zip ties settled into a growing puddle. He didn't seem to notice. The water seeping into his sock was just another quiet indignity in a long silent war. He wasn't looking for a handout. He wasn't causing trouble. He was just trying to outlast the storm. But then the diner's back door creaked open. A young man, barely 20, with a manager's pin crooked on his apron, stared out at him. There was no malice in the young man's eyes. There was something worse. There was inconvenience. He saw a problem, a piece of trash that the rain hadn't washed away. "Hey! You can't be here!" The manager called out, his voice thin against the thunder. "You're bad for business." Elias didn't respond. He just looked at the young man, his gaze steady, carrying a weight the boy couldn't possibly comprehend. That silence, that profound stillness, seemed to spook the manager more than any angry word could. He retreated inside, and a few moments later, Elias saw the blue and red lights painting the wet alley walls. The two officers who approached were a study in contrast. One was young, impatient, his hand resting on his hip, as if Elias were a genuine threat and not a rail-thin old man trying to stay dry. The other was older, his face etched with a weary resignation. He saw the faded eagle globe and anchor emblem on Elias's jacket. For a fleeting second, a flicker of something pity recognition crossed his face. But it vanished as quickly as it came, extinguished by the cold bureaucratic rain. They were just doing their job. They saw the situation, not the man. And that is a mistake that has broken more lives than any weapon. "On your feet, old-timer," the young one said. The handcuffs felt impossibly cold against his wrists. And just like that, Elias Vance was processed. The journey from the alley to the back of the patrol car, to the booking desk, and finally to the sterile, cold waiting room of the Baltimore City District Court was a blur of fluorescent lights and detached voices. He was no longer a man weathering a storm. He was a number on a docket, a file, a shadow dragged into a place that had no room for them. As he sat on the hard wooden bench, waiting for his name to be called, he looked at the people around him, the lawyers in their sharp suits, the clerks shuffling papers, the other defendants lost in their own private storms. He was invisible to them all, and in that moment, the profound and terrible truth of his life settled in. Sometimes the most brutal battles aren't fought on foreign soil under a hail of bullets. Sometimes they are fought in the quiet, unforgiving corridors of indifference, in the agonizingly long moments when the world has simply forgotten you exist. The question wasn't if anyone would see him. The question was, after all these years, was there anything left to see? To understand how a man like Elias Vance ends up a shadow in a courtroom, you have to understand that his war didn't end when the guns fell silent. It just changed shape. It followed him home, a ghost in his own house, for 15 long years. It began with an honorable discharge. After his third tour in Iraq, the Marine Corps sent him home. Not with a parade, but with a folder full of medical papers. Papers that spoke of a traumatic brain injury, a souvenir from an IED that rattled his skull and left hairline fractures in his memory. Papers that mentioned post-traumatic stress disorder, a polite term for the nightmares that clawed their way into his waking hours. He also left with a chest full of medals. Medals for valor, for sacrifice, that he was told would be mailed to his home. They never arrived. His first battle on home soil was fought not with a rifle, but with a pen against an enemy of paper and procedure, the Department of Veterans Affairs. He tried to get help. He stood in lines that snaked around grey buildings. He filled out forms in triplicate, his hands, which were once steady enough to defuse a bomb, now trembling as he tried to remember dates and details that shimmered like heat haze in his mind. This is the anatomy of a system's failure. It's a death by 1,000 paper cuts. He was told there was an 18-month wait for a consistent therapy appointment. His disability claim, the one that would have provided a lifeline, was denied due to a clerical error. He would call a number, be put on hold for hours, only to be told he needed to speak to a different department, which would then transfer him back to the first number. The cause was bureaucracy. The effect was the slow grinding erosion of a man's hope. The very system designed to be his safety net had become a cage. From there, the spiral accelerated. He lost his job as a mechanic, a trade he'd known his whole life. The memory lapses from the TBI made him forget steps, misplaced tools. His boss let him go with a sad shake of the head. His family tried to understand, but his trauma was a wall between them. The man who had left for war, the confident leader, the steady father, had been replaced by a quiet, haunted stranger who would flinch at the sound of a car backfiring and stare at walls for hours. They drifted away not out of cruelty, but out of a helpless exhaustion. One day he couldn't make rent. Then he was living out of his car. Then the car broke down. Each step down was quieter than the last, until he finally landed on the streets of the city he had sworn to protect. The man who once led platoons through enemy territory was now navigating the lonely geography of soup kitchens and shelters. Here lies a tragic and common mistake our society makes. We look at veterans like Elias and we see them as broken. But he wasn't broken. He was wounded. There is a profound difference. A broken thing is discarded. A wounded thing is meant to be healed. He was a warrior, abandoned on a battlefield he didn't choose, left to fight a war with no map, no backup, and no end in sight. So as he sits there on that hard courtroom bench, the ghost of Sergeant Vance is sitting right next to him. The system may have forgotten his name, but his wounds remembered. And soon, in a way, no one could ever expect someone else was about to remember it too. A hero doesn't stop being a hero when they take off the uniform. But a system, through its cold, relentless indifference, can make them forget. The state of Maryland versus Elias Vance. The voice belonged to the prosecutor. A sharp young man in a suit that probably cost more than Elias had seen in a year. He stood with an air of practiced boredom, flipping through the file as if it were an annoying piece of junk mail. "Your Honor," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "this is a simple vagrancy charge. The defendant was found trespassing on private property, creating a public nuisance. The state recommends the maximum penalty and mandatory relocation to a city shelter to clean up the streets." He said clean up the streets like he was talking about sweeping away leaves, not discarding a human being. His argument was the voice of a society that has become allergic to discomfort, a world that values pristine appearances over inconvenient people. Elias didn't flinch. He just stared at the polished floor. His shoulders slumped, accepting the verdict that had been passed on him long before he ever entered this room. But someone else was watching. From her elevated bench, Judge Evelyn Reed looked down at the defendant. She was a woman who had earned her reputation through a sharp mind and an even sharper gavel. In her courtroom, the law was not a suggestion, it was scripture. Her face, usually an unreadable mask of judicial impartiality, was still. Yet as she looked at the man in the tattered Marine Corps jacket, something flickered. It was the name, Vance. It was a common enough name, but it snagged on a thread in the deep tapestry of her memory. She shuffled the papers in front of her, her eyes scanning the details of the arrest report. And then she saw it. The location of the crime. The Blue Sparrow Diner. The Blue Sparrow Diner. Suddenly the cold, sterile courtroom dissolved around her, and she was in her late son's bedroom, the air thick with the smell of old books and dried ink. She was holding a stack of letters, the paper worn soft from 100 readings. Letters from a dusty, sun-scorched place called Fallujah. Letters from her son Leo. He used to write about the Blue Sparrow Diner. He wrote that when he got home, the first thing he was going to do was order their all-American breakfast platter. He wrote about it like it was a piece of heaven, a symbol of a life he was fighting to come back to. The name and the place collided in her mind, creating a spark in the darkness. Her gaze snapped back to the defendant. Could it be the man Leo had written about, the sergeant who... Her breath caught in her throat. The professional mask she wore so well was beginning to crack. Beneath the black robe, she was not Judge Reed anymore. She was Leo's mother. She was a woman staring at a ghost from her son's past. The scales of justice in her mind tipped, weighed down, not by law books but by the unbearable gravity of a mother's grief and a debt she thought could never be repaid. "Counselors," she said, her voice suddenly firm, cutting through the prosecutor's smug dismissal. "This court will take a 30-minute recess." She struck the gavel again, the sound echoing the sudden frantic beating of her own heart. She stood and swept out of the room, leaving behind a stunned prosecutor, a confused defense attorney, and a courtroom buzzing with whispers. They didn't understand. They saw a procedural interruption. They didn't see the storm that had just broken inside the judge. They didn't know that justice isn't always blind. Sometimes, to deliver true justice, it needs to stop and see with its heart. Inside her chambers, the silence was a heavy blanket. Judge Evelyn Reed stood by her window, looking down at the rain-slicked Baltimore streets. But she wasn't seeing them. She was seeing a battlefield of sand and smoke. She was seeing her son's handwriting. Her hand holding the phone to her ear was perfectly steady. The call was answered on the second ring. "Caleb, it's Evelyn," she said, her voice low and urgent, stripped of all judicial formality. "Drop what you're doing. I'm calling in the favor. The big one." A pause. "I have a man in my courtroom. A sergeant. His name is Elias Vance." She let the name hang in the air. "Listen to me. It's about a debt, Caleb. A debt that was never paid. It's in Leo's letters. The ones I showed you." Her voice caught for a fraction of a second, a tiny crack in her armor of control. "Just get here. You'll understand when you see him. You of all people will understand." She hung up without waiting for a reply. Back in the courtroom, the 30-minute recess stretched into 45. The prosecutor was pacing, annoyed. The public defender assigned to Elias was shuffling his papers, utterly bewildered. Elias himself remained a statue of stillness, seemingly unaware of the quiet chaos he had caused. Then the courtroom doors opened. The man who entered was not loud or flashy, but the entire room seemed to turn towards him, drawn by an invisible gravity. He was tall, dressed in a suit that was sharp but not ostentatious, and he moved with a purpose that made everyone else look like they were standing still. This was Caleb Jones, a man who had built a legend by defending the defenseless. He walked past the prosecutor's table without a glance. He walked past the bewildered public defender. He walked directly to the table where Elias Vance sat alone. The entire room held its breath, expecting a hushed legal consultation. What they got was a moment that would be seared into their memories forever. Caleb Jones did not offer a handshake or a business card. He stopped, stood at attention for a brief, perfect second, and then he knelt. He brought himself down to eye level with the homeless man in the tattered jacket. "Sergeant Vance," he asked, his voice a low rumble of profound respect that cut through the silence. "Caleb Jones, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines." He paused, letting the words land with the weight of a shared history. "It's an honor, sir." A lightning bolt of shock coursed through the courtroom. This wasn't a lawyer meeting a client. This was a soldier acknowledging a superior. It was a recognition of a rank that no courtroom, no hardship, no amount of societal neglect could ever strip away. The dynamic of the entire case didn't just shift. It was utterly obliterated. The conflict was no longer about a vagrant and the city. It was about a sergeant and a system that had failed him, and now he had a brother in arms as his shield. The prosecutor stared, his mouth slightly agape. He had seen Elias Vance as a nuisance. Caleb Jones saw him as a hero. And in that one transformative moment, everyone in the room began to understand. True allegiance, the kind that binds souls together, isn't written in law books or sworn in courtrooms. It's forged in shared fire, and its embers can glow for a lifetime, waiting for the right moment to burn bright once more. When the court reconvened, Caleb Jones stood, and the very atmosphere of the room seemed to bend around him. He didn't approach the judge's bench with the usual deference. He stood in the center of the floor, a warrior on his chosen ground. "Your Honor." He began, his voice calm but resonating with an authority that had nothing to do with legal precedent. "We are not here today to discuss a man sleeping in an alley. To do so would be an insult to everyone in this room. We are not here to debate the letter of a municipal code." He paused, letting his gaze sweep from the prosecutor to the judge. "We are here to correct a 15-year-old crime." The prosecutor shot to his feet. "Objection, counsel is testifying." Judge Reed simply raised a hand. "Overruled. Let him speak." Caleb didn't defend the crime. He went on the attack. He put the entire system on trial. He began by systematically dismantling the state's case, exposing its pathetic absurdity. A man seeking shelter from a life-threatening storm is not a nuisance. He is a survivor. A diner manager's discomfort is not grounds for arrest. It is a symptom of a society that has lost its compassion. Then he opened the binder. The papers inside were not legal motions. They were pages from a man's stolen life. "During the recess," Caleb announced, his voice ringing with cold fury, "I acquired the military service record of Sergeant Elias Vance of the United States Marine Corps." He pulled out a document. A record that shows Sergeant Vance was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. A record showing he was awarded 2 Purple Hearts for wounds received in combat. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Elias looked up, his eyes wide with a confusion that was heartbreaking to see. It was as if he were hearing about someone else's life. "These medals were never awarded," Caleb continued, his voice rising. "The support and benefits owed to this wounded warrior were never provided. For 15 years, this man, this hero, has been treated like a ghost by the country he bled for. And I'm about to show you why." He pulled out a final single sheet of paper. This was the moment. The twist of the knife. The reason is this, he said, holding the paper up for the court to see. A catastrophic clerical error. A single disastrous typo made on his discharge paperwork 15 years ago. According to the United States government, according to the very system that was supposed to care for him, Sergeant Elias Vance was not honorably discharged. He let the silence hang in the air, thick and heavy. He was listed, Caleb's voice dropped to a near whisper laced with thunder, as deceased in action. The silence in the courtroom was no longer just quiet. It was a vacuum, a suffocating void where every breath was stolen. Elias Vance was officially a ghost. It explained everything: the denied benefits, the lost records, the years of being invisible. How can you help a man who on paper doesn't exist? This wasn't just a mistake. It was a burial. And lest you think this is just a story, you should know that this bureaucratic nightmare has been a shocking reality for veterans in our country. Men and women who survived the horrors of war only to come home and find out they had been declared dead by a stray keystroke. Caleb Jones turned his body slowly, deliberately to face the prosecutor, who was now pale, his earlier arrogance gone. The state, Caleb said, his voice a blade of ice, is prosecuting a man for being alive when its own paperwork left him for dead. So I will ask you, counselor, who exactly is disturbing the peace here? The question hung in the air, a final devastating indictment. The heaviest burdens we carry are not always the ones on our backs. Sometimes they are the ones buried on paper, lost in forgotten files, and sealed in the broken promises of a nation. The courtroom was frozen. The prosecutor stood like a statue, his case, his career, his entire worldview shattered by a single piece of paper. But it was Judge Evelyn Reed who broke the spell. She didn't use her gavel. She didn't issue an order. She simply stood, a commanding figure in her black robe. And for the first time she spoke directly to Elias. Not as a judge to a defendant, but as one human being to another. Sergeant Vance, she said, her voice impossibly soft, yet it carried to every corner of the room. 15 years ago, my son, Marine Corporal Leo Reed, was serving in your platoon. Elias looked up, his eyes finally meeting hers. The confusion in them was slowly being replaced by a dawning, horrified recognition. I received a letter from him. She continued, pulling a worn, folded piece of paper from a pocket hidden within her robe. Her hand trembled just slightly. A letter he wrote 3 days before he was killed in action. For years I thought it was just his final goodbye. But after today, I finally understand it was also a testimony. She unfolded the paper. This was it. The emotional heart of the entire story. She wasn't summarizing. She was channeling her son's last words. Mom. She began, her voice now a vessel for Leo's. Something happened today. We were on patrol in Fallujah, and we walked right into an ambush. It was chaos, smoke and fire everywhere. I was pinned down with 2 others, and a grenade landed right in front of us. There was no time. We were dead. She paused, taking a shaky breath. And then Sergeant Vance, he did something I'll never understand. He didn't run. He didn't even dive for cover. He threw himself on top of us, using his own body as a shield. He took most of the shrapnel, Mom. He saved us. He looked at me, and even through the pain, he just said, "Stay in the fight, Marine." Her eyes, now shimmering with tears, were locked on Elias. That's where the letter ends, she said, her voice thick with emotion. And at last, the dam inside Elias Vance broke. A sob, raw and ugly, and 15 years in the making, tore itself from his throat. The carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart The years of guilt and grief he had carried in silence, all of it came crashing down. The survivor's guilt, the most insidious wound of all, poured out of him. He was just a kid. Elias choked out tears streaming down his face, washing away years of dust and grime. He had his whole life. I was the old man. It should have been me. Judge Reed stepped down from the bench, a move that left the entire courtroom breathless. She walked across the floor and stopped in front of him. She was no longer a judge. She was just a mother. "You listen to me," she said, her voice fierce with a mother's love. "You didn't take my son's future. You gave him one. You gave him 3 more days. You gave him enough time to write that letter. You gave a grieving mother a final goodbye from her child, a story of his last hero. That is not a burden, Sergeant. That is a gift. A debt my family can never, ever repay." She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. In that moment, the courtroom ceased to exist. There was only a soldier who had forgotten his worth, and a mother who had never forgotten his sacrifice. The scars we carry are not a sign of what was lost. They are a testament to what was survived. And Elias Vance had survived for far too long on his own. Judge Reed's words hung in the air not as a legal ruling, but as a benediction. The crime was not sleeping in an alley. The crime was forgetting. And in that courtroom, Elias Vance was finally remembered. With a final gentle pat on Elias's shoulder, Judge Reed returned to her bench. Her face was no longer that of a grieving mother, but of a righteous arbiter of justice. She looked at the prosecutor, who seemed to have shrunk in his expensive suit. "All charges against Sergeant Elias Vance are hereby dismissed with extreme prejudice," she declared, her voice ringing with an iron finality. "Furthermore, this court orders the state of Maryland, in conjunction with the Department of Veterans Affairs, to immediately rectify Sergeant Vance's status. All back pay, all owed benefits, and all medical support for the past 15 years are to be calculated and delivered within 30 days. She struck her gavel, and the sound wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. As if on cue, the courtroom doors opened once more. 2 uniformed Marines, their dress blues immaculate, marched in with solemn purpose. One carried a velvet-lined case. They stopped in front of Elias. The lead officer opened the case, revealing the silver star, its polished surface gleaming under the harsh courtroom lights. But before the medal could be pinned, a movement came from an unexpected corner. It was the young, impatient cop, the one who had arrested Elias in the alley. He stood up, his back ramrod straight. He raised his hand to his brow in a crisp, perfect salute. That single gesture broke the dam. The older officer beside him stood and saluted. Caleb Jones stood and saluted. Then one by one others in the room rose to their feet. The clerks, the bailiffs, even the bewildered prosecutor. Their hands raised in a silent, unified chorus of respect. The story doesn't end there, with a medal and a salute. That's not how life works. The real victory happens in the quiet moments that follow. The final 5 minutes of this journey show us the aftermath. As Elias walked out of the courthouse, the storm had passed. The first rays of a new sunrise were breaking over the Baltimore skyline, casting long, hopeful shadows. He wasn't met with a parade, but with something better. A small group from a veterans outreach program founded by Caleb Jones was waiting for him. They didn't see a project, they saw a brother. We see Elias a month later. He's not living in a mansion. He's in a clean, modest apartment at a veterans support community. He's in therapy, finally talking about the ghosts he'd carried for so long. We see him having coffee with Evelyn Reed, not in a courtroom, but at the Blue Sparrow Diner. They are not judge and defendant. They are 2 survivors bound by a shared history of loss and a profound unspoken honor. The final shot is of Elias looking at his own reflection in his new apartment window. For the first time in years, he doesn't see a shadow. He doesn't see a ghost. He sees the steady, clear eyes of a man who has come home. He sees Sergeant Elias Vance. A hero is not defined by a single act of bravery on a battlefield. A hero is defined by the quiet courage it takes to endure the long, cold winter that follows. They are defined by the strength to survive being forgotten. The world is full of people like Elias Vance. They are not ghosts. They are sitting next to you in traffic, standing behind you in the grocery line, or living down the street. They are just waiting for someone to truly see them. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of a single act of recognition, then you're already a part of our community. Help us keep telling these stories by hitting that like button. It tells the algorithm that compassion is worth sharing. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every week we strive to uncover the extraordinary stories hidden in ordinary lives. But most importantly, go down to the comments right now and type one word: honor. It's more than just a word. It's a promise. A promise not to forget. A promise to see the hero next to us. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.